let me get you the latest update, because Planescape Torment demolished Grim Fandango in the quarterfinals.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that is interesting.
You really crushed it.
Wow. Grim Fandango was the first game I ever played where I'm like, yes, games are art. Yeah,
Really?
I love that game so much. Wow. I am very flattered. That's crazy.
No, but the next round is a little bit weirder, because you're up. Planescape Torments is up against Persona 5.
Oh, I do not stand much of a chance there. You know, I was at the Game Awards, and we were sitting next to some Persona fans. And when they announced Persona for Super Smash Brothers, that entire row like exploded. Like they almost ripped the chairs out of the ground. They were so excited. I feared for my life.
In the other semi-final, it's The Last of Us versus BioShock. What game do you think would be the best for the final?
That's tough because I'm biased. I actually didn't like the story in Last of Us, even though I loved the way it was executed.
Yes.
And actually, like, I don't know if you guys had this frustration too, but like, this is one instance where I thought the game mechanic was killing the story. Right at the end of the game, you start getting audio logs which you'd never gotten before, and they would stop everything when you played them. So you would sit there for 2 minutes in an action game going, how come I can't move around while this person's recording is playing, but yet I still have to hear it to get a sense of what's going on? And that was driving me nuts. But yeah, Last of Us, I was like, if someone told me the story, I wouldn't have played it. But it was more the characters you met, and then how natural the interactions were. And then, sorry, I'm going to completely go off on a tangent, but I'll try and make this short. And then I heard about how much the voice actors influenced the story. And apparently the original story wasn't what ended up in the game. And then seeing all the corrections the voice actors made to their characters and the approach to them, I think also really sold the story too. So it's kind of a complicated thing.
Is it a hard thing for a writer to see actors just wing it at the set, to wing a story you carefully crafted?
No, actually, I think that all the voice acting work I did prior to going freelance had a lot of flaws with it that I didn't realize until I saw how other studios did voice acting. So, for example, when Ken Levine does a game, he doesn't just march in the studio and dump off a script. He gets to know the actor before the session ever happens. He starts a dialogue with them. He talks about the character. He talks about the story in sort of a more informal setting. And I think that establishes a good basis of, getting a feel for each other's personalities, where, the script is coming from, versus, holy crap, we have 4 hours to record. Here's the script, start reading lines. We'll worry about pickups later, which was usually the case when I worked at companies full time, because there just wasn't a lot of time in the studio, and we usually had a lot of lines to record.
What was the first game you played where you loved the story?
This is going to be a strange answer. I can remember the games I played where I remember the story, which is usually a good sign, because that something obviously stood out about it. But usually when it comes to stories that I've loved for games, I usually find it's more about a game mechanic they did with a story that makes it stand out. Like, hey, the protagonist dies halfway through and you may never get him back. Or, hey, you were supposed to save the world, but we blew it up halfway through. Or, hey, this is mostly a combat game where you shoot people, but now there's this, period in the game where you download your brain into an android's brain and you fight using your intelligence. Like, all that stuff was good story moments for me. And I'm like, wow, that's really cool. But it was because of the game mechanics involved. But to answer your question, so first game story that I loved. So I'm old, so these are going to be really old examples. Infocom was this company that did text adventures way back when.
Yeah, we know Infocom.
Oh, thank God. Well, in case anyone listening doesn't. But basically, since that's what was mostly selling the game, they would turn out these really cool adventure titles. And there is two I remember. One is they did a pyramid plundering game called Infidel, which kind of surprised me because the game does judge you. It actually puts you in the role of a certain protagonist who's obviously trying to, rob this pyramid or, unearth it for, his own reasons. But then at the end of the game, they judge you for something that happened in the manual. And it was kind of an interesting decision, but I thought it was appropriate for the things they were introducing in the game as well. And the other one was Planetfall, because I think that was the first time I had a companion in a text adventure game where I genuinely felt a sense of loss when that companion sacrificed themselves. And I'm like, wow, like I got so attached to this game that I actually felt something for one of these other characters, and I thought that was a great achievement. And also, I gotta say, like Grim Fandango, I actually, again, like I told you guys, like that was the game where I was like, wow, like games can be art. And it was that moment where that song of Grim Fandango like plays like right in the middle of the game where they're in that
Rubacava, the
yes.
Casablanca place. Yeah.
Yes. And as soon as that song plays, and I realized the song lyrics were sort of blending into the title of the game and what was going on, I'm like, that is art right there. That is fantastic. And I have a hearty round of applause for Grim Fandango.
But at the time you were working full-time as a game developer. How come that game blew you away like that?
Because I think a lot of the games I've been playing previously had never made an attempt to do something like that. Like a lot of RPGs hadn't considered music fully in that way, nor would they actually have scores with lyrics. Also, I think because Grim Fandango is an adventure game, I think adventure games tend to have much stronger narratives because of how they're constructed. And a lot of RPGs had some cool mechanics, like, I was playing Ultima Underworld 1 and 2 at the time to sort of catch up on my RPG lore. And they had great game mechanics, but I think, if I were to explain Ultima Underworld 1's story to someone, I don't think they'd have a good reaction to it, and nor would I. It's because it's pretty terrible. But it was the experience of going through those RPGs ended up being better than the story. But I felt Grim Fandango actually was making an attempt to be artistic and be something more.
How did you even get started writing video games? How did you break into the scene?
So that was kind of an accident. I was intending to have computer game writing sort of be like my day job, like, hey, it'll pay the bills while I go do something more fun. Like I'll write comic books, or I'll write novels, or I'll write adventures for Dungeons and Dragons in my free time. But then when I got into computer gaming, I discovered that I actually loved doing it. So that ended up becoming sort of my primary profession. But it was all mostly like, because before I started doing computer game writing, I was like writing like game modules and sort of like game adventures for like pen and paper products like Champions and Super World. And I actually worked with Monty Cook. He was editor at a place called Hero Games for a while, and he was sick of seeing my submissions. Like I exhausted the guy with all the stuff I sent him. He was getting tired. He was like, just don't send me any more of this stuff. I haven't gone through your other submissions yet. Like I can't. And then finally I caught a break, getting published with one of those adventures, and then I got another one published, then another one. And then I'm like, this is kind of, off and on work. Does anybody know anybody in the computer game industry? And then someone gave me a recommendation for Interplay. I went out for the interview, and then they hired me onto their Dungeons and Dragons division.
You are one of the most prolific game writers out there. But why is it that game writers aren't that front and center?
Well, I don't know if I generate a lot of content, and I know some people would probably disagree. It's, I think it may seem like I write a lot, but sometimes I'll get onto projects where the writing that they need done is so much smaller than doing a 2-year RPG that you can actually do it like in 2 weeks. Like when I worked on FTL Advanced Edition, that was really about 2 weekends worth of work to do a lot of encounters, but they were so easy compared to writing a companion for a role-playing game that I'm like, oh, this is such a relief. Like the words are just coming out. Like I can structure all these encounters and it's so easy. And so I think RPGs actually prepared me to sort of write easier for other genres because RPGs are so complicated. But in terms of why writers aren't front and center, so I don't think they should be. And I think sometimes there's a danger when you elevate an individual developer over a team or a company, because it's been a rare thing for me that I haven't written with a team. Like it's usually I work with a bunch of other writers. A number of them write better than me. And I think it's that sort of combined team effort that really makes a game shine. And when you call out someone specifically versus the other people they work with, like that person couldn't have done it alone. And chances are the game became much better for the other people's involvement too. So honoring a team over the individual, I think, is probably is the best way to go.
That's really humble of you.
But when you work on a team with 60 other people and maybe 5 other writers, and like for example, like when I was doing New Vegas Old World Blues, I worked with a writer named Travis Stout, and Travis was much better than me. Like he wrote, the player responses were more entertaining. The point of quests was much more to the point, and I learned a lot from him. I'm like, wow, Travis is just a really good writer, and I think he's working at Massive right now. But that was a clear case, and that was one of many cases where I was like, wow, I have learned more by working with this person, and that person deserves more kudos than calling me out individually for working on this project. And also it would be unfair if someone called me out individually for working on that project, because the contributions other people were doing was just, was far more than mine. So I don't know. It's just the way it is.
You worked on a lot of RPGs and a lot of the best RPGs of the last 30 years or something, but you also worked on shooters like Prey. What's the difference writing for an RPG than writing for a shooter like Prey?
That's a good question. So Prey was sort of my first, I think, my first sort of attempt at, I want to work in a first-person shooter. And Raphael, one of the owners of Arcane, he really liked Planescape, and he's like, "Hey, do you want to come write on Prey?" I'm like, "Well, I'm like, this is interesting." So I sort of cracked my knuckles. And I'm like, "I haven't really done this like full on before, but let me give it a shot." And it was great. I think one of the nice things about freelancing is because you're working in these other genres, it sort of helps you realize what RPGs can bring to that genre, and also what you can draw from that genre and apply it to RPGs as well. And with Prey, it was a very good learning experience for sort of how to tell a streamlined story with audio, like keep that to a minimum, but being aware of the environment and the encounters the player is going through and making sure that you're pacing the story for that, because the worst thing you can do is give a huge audio lore dump when it's very likely the player is going to be fighting like 13 mimics in the next 30 seconds, because he's not going to listen to anything in the audio log if this encounter is going on. So you have to be careful, like how do you ration out that lore? Is it necessary? Is there some way you can do it visually? That's an approach that Prey sort of like hammered home, and I certainly enjoyed working on it. The first time I got attacked by a mimic was pretty frightening. I was like, did that chair just attack me? Oh my god, not the table! Oh my! And then a coffee cup, and it was crazy.
Okay, could you walk us through the process of writing a game? Where do you start when you write a game?
Yeah, so the first thing I do is I try and gather The first thing is show me like the one-page vision doc, the one sentence of what this game's about. Like, is it a survival shooter? Is it, is it a mid-tier, like a mid-play sequel to Fallout 3? Like, tell me what the parameters and vision for this game is. And that gives me sort of like some bookends to figure out what I have to work with. Like, hey, if we're doing New Vegas, clearly, like, we have to use the same engine. Like, there needs to be a signature city, like there was Washington, D.C. in Fallout 3, et cetera, et cetera. And then that informs a lot of story choices. And then the next thing you want to do is gather all the system documents you can. Like, hey, what's the new gameplay stuff they're introducing? Like, what new systems are there? And then once you sort of have that raw mass of material and like you've learned all you can about the franchise, if appropriate, or you've written lore for the franchise, then what you do is you sort of grow the story out of that and go, okay, with all of these things present, how do I construct a narrative that complements the game mechanics and sort of reinforces like whatever feel the game is trying to have. Like, if I'm going for survival horror, what elements should I include in the story, or what mystery should be there to sort of reinforce that horrific fear of the unknown, whatever it happens to be. After that, I try and get the sign off on all the leads on a one-page brief for the story. We're like, hey, here's where I think this could go. What do you guys think about this? And then discuss that, get approval, then start fleshing that out more and more. Like, a one-pager becomes a four-pager. That four-pager starts branching off into, well, now we're going to make all these companion character documents, or documents with the antagonist, protagonist, the areas where the game plays out. And then you keep fleshing it out more and more. And ideally, especially for an RPG, you want to start assigning sections of the story to individual team members. Like, hey, Dave, you take this section for, or they're exploring the sewers, or, whatever it happens to be. And you sort of give people ownership of those sections to flesh out within some story requirements you might have. Like, hey, Dave, go flesh out the sewers, but keep in mind, like, they have to find these 3 things there and learn this one piece of information about this NPC before they leave the area. And then you just let that person go within that aspect. But yeah, it's mostly like just adding more and more layers until, you've written all the dialogue, you play through the games, and then you just start play testing the hell out of it.
That sounds so easy. One question a user of us, a listener of us had, he wants to know, and that question fits quite nicely right here. He wants to know, how does your work integrate itself into a dynamic production process? Like, when the game director decides on a whim to change something, and he comes to your desk and says, well, Chris, guess who has to write another quest line that takes place in the sewers? That's you now. How do you work with that?
So being a narrative designer / writer, you learn to expect stuff like that. What you want to do is, first off, understand why the request is happening, because they may be asking you for this and not realize that it may need to be done in 3 other places and not just in this one location. So you want to get a sense for like what's the reasoning behind it, and also that will help you be a better writer for that project director, because then you're like, oh, I see how this person thinks, or here's what they wanted to see with the vision that wasn't there or I missed. And now I can account for that in future stuff that I do, or iterations of work that's already in the game. So I do that. I also make sure whoever my producer is knows the cost of what adding that work is, and like, hey, this is going to take 3 more days, like, or we have 3 more days, but really we have to be finished in 7 days, and we were planning to use the 3 days for this other thing. Which thing do you guys want to drop so that we can get this element in the game? And then we try and figure out if there's any sort of give and take that has to happen with the content. Because if you try and like crush everything and like crush every whim, if it is a whim, into a game, sometimes you just end up with this half-finished, kitchen sink of, quests that may have had potential, but because there wasn't enough time to really polish them, they sort of come across kind of like half-assed.
Was there a part of a game that you really, really, really loved and that got cut? for release?
Yeah. So we were among the many things that were cut from the Niceville Republic 2, of which I take responsibility for that game feeling half-assed toward the end, and possibly in the middle, and possibly at the beginning. Is I was really sorry that we not only had to cut the end sequences because I felt that was probably the most reactive part of the game, but also one of our designers, Kevin Saunders, he had designed a really cool approach to this droid planet we were going to have in the game. It's basically a giant planet, just droids running around it, but it itself has its own consciousness as a droid, and we thought it'd be really cool. And then we thought it would also tie in nicely to the other companion arcs, but we just didn't have time to finish it, among other things. So we had to cut that, and that was kind of a sad moment, but it was for the best.
KOTOR 2 was also mentioned by our community. They really love that story, even if it got stuff cut. And KOTOR 1 was in our roster of the 8 best games, but it didn't work.
Yeah, but KOTOR 1 was a great game.
Yeah, a fantastic story.
It lost to BioShock.
Yeah,
with 51% to 49.
Yeah, we're also
wow, that's close.
Yeah.
That's really close.
Very close. Yeah. Do you think, Chris, that stories for games are more difficult than for other media to write?
I think it depends on the writer, because for me, writing game stories is far easier than trying to write a comic book or a short story or a novel, because I can sort of do comics, but I'm terrible at writing sort of what I call fixed prose. Like I realize as a writer, a lot of my skill is, or mistakes that I've made that I've learned from, involves like, hey, well, there, this story could go all, 3 different ways, but because you're doing a game, you can actually write 3 different stories in this one character or in this one scene or in this one situation. But then when you get to prose, you have to choose one. And that's been something of a stumbling block for me, where I'm like, oh, but I'm imagining all these different permutations of how the story could go, but I have to choose one, and then that becomes difficult.
So you have a problem with commitment, huh?
I hope my wife isn't listening.
In film, there are a couple of principles for a great story. There needs to be a protagonist, and he has a need, and the thing that stands in the way of getting that need. And then in really great films, maybe there's the thing that the character really wants. Is it similar in gaming? Can you break down a game in simple terms like that, or is it different?
Unfortunately, I think the pillars or the parameters depends on what genre you're writing for. And I say unfortunate because I'm biased towards RPGs, and I think RPGs have a pretty good sense of what those things are. Like for example, you want to create a story where the player has agency. You see reactions to you having that agency. Like you see feedback on the actions you've done in significant ways. You've set up a stage or a story where it's quite clear that your actions are important, either to you as a character personally, or it's sort of like the global worldscape. Like not only do you get consequences, but you see why those consequences matter in a larger context. Also, there has to be room for the player to grow, both statistic-wise and also just the more they explore the story of the RPG or the game, they learn new things about both the world and then hopefully learn something about themselves as a player and a player character by whatever decisions they make that they're faced with in that environment. I think, Witcher 3 is great about that. Lastly, I think you should have the chance to role play. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but sometimes that could be role playing a fixed character. And sometimes it can be just having the freedom to grow a character and customize a character however you want. And I think there's benefits and drawbacks to both. But I think those are some of the things that we start off with when doing a game story.
But in terms of great storytelling, when we did our episode Grim Fandango versus Planescape Torment, we both thought of both games that they have a great exposition. You know, you get put into that world, immediately you know what you have to do, what your objective is, and you know how to get there and what could possibly stand in your way. And in both kind of games, it's basically yourself that stands in the way of getting there. Do you think that a lot of the games stumble with that?
I think whenever you don't present the player with a clear objective, you run the risk of confusing them, losing momentum, like you were saying. I mean, one thing that I always like about Game of Thrones is even though the plot gets incredibly convoluted and there's a lot of like side characters popping in and out and dying left and right, but what I think the show does, and then also the books obviously did, is that no matter what the chapter was, like I knew what the stakes were for any scene, like what was going to be gained or lost, and who I was rooting for in each scene. Even though there were so many of them, it was always pretty clear to me, like, okay, well, these guys are currently the antagonists, and they may not be that way by the 5th book, but right now, these people are my enemy, and it's important to defeat them. And even though I don't know the larger reasons behind why this might be happening, it's pretty clear in the moment what I need to do. And I think that's sort of the best approach for any section of a game. Like, does the player know what they're trying to accomplish, and what level of urgency do you want to give to that? And with RPGs, it's a challenge sometimes because you don't want to introduce so much urgency that players don't do things that they like to do in RPGs, like explore, like investigate the environment, and
like find your son in Fallout 4. Yeah.
Well, that's a different thing. I will say, like, so I have this whole. Sorry, I'm going to go on a spiel about open world games. So what drives me a little crazy about the approach to open world games and narrative is that sometimes it feels like they're trying to impose a single player story on an open world experience. And I don't think that works very well. And I think that you have to make the narrative open as well. Because the player doesn't, you know, it's like you're switching gears. It's like, okay, well now I'm going to put my blinders on and go down the A, B, C, D story path. But really, like, the environment is beckoning me to do all sorts of other cool stuff with side quests and go over here and do this. And finding some union between those two, I think, is really important. But I think the most difficult conversations I've had are when people are insistent upon, well, I understand where you're coming from, but it still needs a single player story. And I'm like, I think you can accomplish that in a different way that would be better for the player experience. And then we debate it.
Let's talk a little bit about Planescape Torment, the game who has a great chance at going to the final. It's a pretty weird game in a weird world. How did you even begin writing this game?
Yeah, so the process I mentioned earlier about how I approach game stories was the same thing for Planescape. So first off, I absorbed everything I could about the franchise. I'm like, okay, what's the aesthetic rules here? Like, what are players expecting when they go to this D&D campaign setting? Because Planescape was a campaign setting that TSR / Wizards of the Coast had for players playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I read all the modules. I tried to read all the books, although that took a while. So I was like halfway through the books when production started. And then the second part of that was there was a whole series of technical limitations, like, you know, New Vegas had with, you know, the editor and expectations from Fallout 3. Part of the quote unquote rules for Planescape was, okay, well, it has to use BioWare's Infinity Engine, which was great. But when you decide that, there's a lot of also narrative things that come along with that. We're like, okay, well, now I know how the dialogue system's going to work and how character progression's going to work and how backgrounds are built and how much we could probably get done in the time provided. And once I had those things, then I started fleshing out a story around that. And I'm like, okay, well, Planescape is all about being unconventional. So what are elements of RPGs that I think would be good to sort of turn on their head? Because that would actually complement this franchise. It would strengthen the message of this franchise. So a lot of the ideas in Planescape came from, well, what if we don't worry about death? Like, what if, a lot of characters or creatures that you took for granted as evil and needed to be destroyed in other games are actually helpful in this game? Or what if you made rats dangerous? Or what if we threw swords out the window? Or what if there's no halflings and no frickin' dwarves anywhere? Wouldn't that be like? And all those elements informed, the story of the game, and then sort of your journey. And Planescape was very much, because one of the things I was sick of was you start an RPG and literally like, hey, go save the princess, or hey, go save this nation you know nothing about, or go save a family member you're not really attached to. And that bored me, and I'm like, I don't want to care about this shit. Like, I don't care. But I'm like, but if we started a game where you are the mystery and everything revolves around you and every single NPC might know something about you that makes you more powerful, suddenly that seemed to be a much easier thing for a player to understand and get motivated by, versus, oh no, the princess is in another castle. Like,
I just
Kann ich noch was fragen?
yeah, of course.
Okay. And all this philosophical stuff who was discussed around the game, did you have all this philosophical stuff in mind when you write the game, or was it,
some of it. Other parts of it came from the universe itself, because the whole belief equals reality was a big part of Planescape, and then we looked for ways to leverage that in the game. Like, you can create new characters by simply bringing up their name in conversation with people.
It's so great.
Yeah. Well, part of that was even game mechanic deterrent, because I'm like, wow, there needs to be some advantage to character lying. And I'm like, what could be an advantage? I'm like, well, you kind of lie about your name a lot. And I'm like, but what if that made someone suddenly come into existence? That might be kind of cool. And so there were elements like that. But other philosophy elements was more things that either setting up character arcs, like with Ravel Puzzle Well. There were certain things and questions that she brought up that actually were determined by her character summary, because hey, well, we want to build her up as this big scary mythological figure, and so what do scary mythological figures do? Well, they ask you riddles, like they pose impossible questions to you, and then it's quite clear, they have the power to do all these horrible things to you if you don't know the answer. And so a lot of that stuff actually would sometimes come from the characters, and other stuff would just come from other books I read or films I'd read where I thought, hey, that's kind of a neat idea. Like, I wonder if there's a place in Planescape for it. And because Planescape's so open, like, you can do anything in that setting, which amazed me, because I didn't realize that D&D would allow itself to sort of like be opened up like that. And that was a perfect canvas just to use all these ideas on, because in Planescape, like, everything fits.
I just finished the game like 3 weeks ago for the first time. It was really amazing. And what I really found interesting is that Planescape is like a bizarro world of RPG design. Everything that you take for granted in other games is flipped on its head. Why do you think that no other game writer or designer had the same thinking about designing a game world like you, where you say, this is how it's done right now, and we're going to do the opposite of that?
I don't know for sure, but if I were to hazard some guesses, the first thing would be there's a lot of direction, especially within larger game companies, of not deviating too far from a certain direction that they think players are comfortable with. And Planescape is definitely way off that path. The second answer I'd probably give is that Planescape was kind of under the radar at Interplay for a long time. Like, people didn't really pay attention to it. Like, it was considered like, a B or C product that would come out eventually and generate some revenue, but it wasn't nearly as important as, say, Baldur's Gate, which was more traditional fantasy. So that helped. And by the time like people did get involved towards the end, a lot of the stuff had already sort of been set down in terms of like the game design, narrative, etc. Another thing is like, and I don't think this is the case, but with Planescape, like once like I decided to go weird, like I committed. I'm like, you know what? The brakes are off. Like the setting is perfect for it. Like just go. And for a long time, like I think for about a year, I was the only one on that project. So I wrote a first pass story character. Oh yeah, that was great. Oh, it was perfect. It was bliss. The only other company I knew that ever had the opportunity to do that was BioWare, and I was so happy that BioWare had a process where they actually did a pass of the story first and figured out, okay, well, here's the story we're going to tell, and then implement it in the game. And I'm like, that just sounds like bliss to me. So that helped a lot. And also, lastly, the game made a profit, but it didn't like sell super well. So I think that people probably took the lesson that when you start deviating too much from people's comfort zones, you're probably not going to get the sales traffic that you want. And at the end of the day, especially back then, like publishers, obviously, the bottom line is the top thing. That's what they care about. Like, you can put your artistic sensibilities in the in the locker because here's the accounting report. And here's what we need. So.
But Planescape also has a lot of text, like a lot of text. Yes. And when you wrote for a year, you just basically wrote like 10 books or something, I imagine. Why do you think that games don't use text as much as 20 years ago?
Well, first off, I don't think they should. Reading is great. Reading is great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like, toss your books away. What I'm saying is if reading is one thing, playing a game is another. And if you're not thinking of new ways to present that written information, you're probably not doing your job as a narrative designer. Like, how are you using your audio? Like, how are you coordinating with the area designers to set up this world space so it's also telling part of the story? Like, this is kind of a classic example, but like if you go through like a museum level in a first-person shooter, and then like you see like all the exhibits and history playing out as you're fighting, through these corridors, that's not a bad way of presenting the history of a person or a world. And it's being done visually without interrupting the player's movements or their pacing. Reading definitely makes you have to stop and go through the text. And that is not something that a lot of players are always happy with. I'm not always happy with it, especially if the text is going nowhere and it's clearly going on too long or someone's being indulgent. I'm sorry, I'm being rude. But clearly like what I loved about Witcher 3 is like the lore items I'd read usually had some nugget of information in them that would help me as a player or help solve some mystery or figure out where an item was. And I liked that a lot more because it not only sort of gave you more lore of the world, but it also gave you something tangible at the end of it. And I think that's a much better way to present lore information than simply, reading 100 pages of, text in a journal or a codex. Like, I think that's sort of pushing the player away from the gameplay.
What was your favorite quest in Planescape Torment?
Well, that's tough. Well, I don't know if it was a quest, but I really liked doing a lot of the companion arcs. Like, I liked the whole Dakon's Unbroken Circle of Zerthamon. Like that was a very late game addition, but when I was writing his companion arc, I'm like, wow, I've got a priest character here who hasn't really had a chance to talk about his religion, and I'm like, well, that seems wrong. And so I started, okay, well, what would the Githzerai religion be like? Like, they need all this mental discipline to survive their home lane, and then from there, that just kept building, and I feel slightly guilty because it was also kind of subversive, and that it was actually not undermining, but questioning some of the Forgotten Realms lore, because it was introducing the idea that the hero of the Githzerai culture actually wasn't a hero at all, and he'd gotten brainwashed by his previous masters. And I'm like, well, I wonder if TSR will approve of this, but they did. I don't think they noticed. So I'm like, okay, well, I guess that's in. So
they didn't make the stats checks.
Yeah, and I sometimes worry with franchise holders they miss subtleties like that, especially like with Niceville Republic 2 and like New Vegas. Like sometimes I wonder if they miss certain things that we slipped in there, but I guess time will tell.
Was there any difference between writing a Planescape Torment and writing Tides of Newman Era?
Yeah, so with Newman Era, like I gave some feedback to Colin McComb's story, and Colin McComb worked with me on Planescape Torment. And I also wrote one of the companions, but the thrust of the story wasn't I guess coming from. I guess the approach I had in Newman Era was, okay, so I have this companion. And this amount of writing and character portrayal, how do I use that companion to inform the player about the new world of Newman Era that they're in, and also and point out some of the uniqueness of it, and then also how does this character's arc support the story that Colin set up, and those were kind of so that the writing was more focused in that respect. The other thing was, because Newman Era was intended as a spiritual successor, because they couldn't use Planescape again, even though they had the Torment name, so they had to sort of start from scratch and sort of keep the principles of Planescape into the new game. Part of the decision with writing for Newman Era was I realized that a lot of the companions in your party weren't very fun. Like they didn't joke around very much. They had some really serious issues, and it's fine if even a funny character has serious issues. But one of the things that I think made Planescape a little more tolerable at the beginning was that there was someone with you that you at least understood and could identify with, and even though his jokes were bad, like you might get a chuckle or two out of him every once in a while, and it helped you sort of like have an anchor to the universe while all this weirdness was going on. So the companion that I wrote for Newman Era was intended to be that type of character that you're like, oh, well, I get this guy's shtick, and then of course we'll reverse it later. But it was something like, hey, let's introduce some levity into this game, because that's also an important part of what I think made Planescape.
Let's talk about the future. Where do you think story-driven games are headed?
Well, I think I'm going to sort of like screw this answer up by going into the past somewhat. So,
we don't care. We go to the past all the time.
I guess what's been encouraging to me as a game writer is the increasing amount of importance publishers and any game developer puts on story. Because that wasn't always the case when I started out in the industry. Like, stories were just kind of like the something you slapped over the gameplay and then you were done. However, once publishers saw the dollar value in a game having a good story or a good story interactive experience, Half-Life 1 really shook up the first-person genre by creating much more of a narrative environment. And we can look back at it now and go, oh, it's not terribly deep. But for the time, it did something new with the first-person genre that sort of set a new bar for what people should do. So, and then also, I think a number of publishers did not like seeing their game get tanked in reviews because the story wasn't good. So a lot of job opportunities for writers popped up, which was good. So I expect that trend to continue. And I think stories will start getting even more sophisticated than they have been previously. It's been really interesting seeing a number of genres start incorporating like RPG and narrative mechanics into their design. Like Assassin's Creed Odyssey surprised me. I'm like, what? I'm like, oh my God, I'm playing an RPG. And they didn't even call it an RPG. I'm like, oh my God, it's everywhere now. So seeing those elements start becoming more common in games actually has been really kind of cool to see. I'm like, oh, wow, like suddenly all the genres are kind of bleeding together and taking the best parts. So yeah, that's been kind of encouraging.
You were talking about BioWare, and BioWare is now about to release Anthem. And Anthem is a shared world shooter where the story takes backseat. Are you sad for the good old BioWare, or even excited because of the storytelling challenge of such a shooter?
I have not followed Anthem. I had heard some mention that, while it will have story elements, it wasn't going to have the same prominence that you might expect from, say, like a Dragon Age or some of BioWare's older titles. And that I guess is sort of in keeping with the style of game, but I always felt that one of BioWare's many strengths was how they did the stories for their games. And they created a lot of characters that people love. And while I still think that's possible if you push the story back a bit, the fact that that's not like weighed as heavily as, say, Dragon Age, for example, that would make me kind of sad. And then, another thing about BioWare is like, of the people I used to know there, like almost none of them are there anymore. David Gator's off doing, his own thing, thank God. And then, Mike Laidlaw left, and I'm like, oh, that sucks. And then, I got the chance to work with him on this game called Waylanders this past year. And I think that, BioWare really lost someone really special with Mike. And the fact that, he's on to other things, I think is a loss for BioWare.
I saw that you're working on a game with Ken Levine. Ken Levine's BioShock is also in our roster for best story in a game. Any hints what you might expect? You guys working together? I know it's really secret. I know. No.
It is. Yeah. If I said anything, I would be killed in a variety of exciting ways. All I can say is it's. I don't know if I can even describe the experience. I've been working on it for a while. It's amazing, and I think it's going to be very, very cool. I wish I could say more. I can't wait till I can say more.
Next time, maybe.
Okay, last question.
Last two.
Last two questions.
One is really easy. And the other one is extremely, extremely hard. So buckle up.
Oh, man.
The first one is the easy one. What's the game you worked on you're most proud of?
That is completely unfair.
See, I lied.
I'm proud of them for different reasons. Like sometimes it was the process we used to finish a game that was taking a nosedive, and like, hey, we managed to pull it up before completely crashed. Like it, may not have done super well, but I think Alpha Protocol had a whole shitload of challenges.
I like the game a lot. It had some mechanical challenges, but
you are very kind. But like half of that game's development was just wasted by managerial direction, and you're like, wow, okay, that's and when you're struggling and fighting to fix a game that's already halfway through in a state like that, that's not a great place to be in. But when you get to the finish line, you're like, okay, well, that was pretty difficult, and I learned a lot, and I'm proud of that. And I wish it could have been done differently, but that's things that you keep in mind for the postmortem. You go, we shouldn't do X, Y, and Z again because here are the problems that result. and hopefully we can learn from that. And we didn't always. Sometimes we were lucky enough to do that, but not always.
So here's the hard one. For our podcast, we had to choose the 8 best stories in games. So here's the hard question. Which 8 games would you have chosen? Which games have the best story?
Wow. Okay, so well, I confess that my game knowledge is nowhere near compared to many players out there. So I have a very limited library that I played, and I try and play them very thoroughly. So I wouldn't say these are the best stories out there, but there are stories in games that I have a lot of respect for. One of the recent ones is Insomniac's Spider-Man game. I think the way they took the Spider-Man universe and introduced its cast of characters was really well done. It was very well crafted. I don't know if someone who isn't a fan of Spider-Man comics would have the same thrill of going through that game, but the way that they introduced each of those characters and the look of each of those characters, it reminded me a lot of Arkham Asylum. But the challenge with Arkham Asylum is I think, Batman's cast of villains are just a lot more interesting. But I think that Insomniac did a really good job with the Spider-Man universe. And then when it came out around the time as Into the Spider-Verse, like that was like a double whammy of goodness. So that was a huge
movie
plus.
Is so good. It's
oh my god!
What a movie! It's so great.
That movie, like Pixar does this, and then Into the Spider-Verse did this. Like they take an incredibly difficult to explain concept if someone was trying to tell you it, and they just reduced it into the right amount of parts where you could digest what was going on, and I never felt confused unless they wanted me to feel confused. And even better, and this is something all good games do if they're inheriting a franchise especially, is they take really shitty characters like the Prowler, who no one knows who the Prowler is. Like the Prowler is like this 4th string villain of Spider-Man universe. No one cares. But Into the Spider-Verse, the Prowler is terrifying, and he's cool, and he's important to the story. And you're like, wow, this is a well-crafted narrative, both visually, animation-wise, and how they chose to sort of elevate characters that people wouldn't give two craps about. So yeah, Into the Spider-Verse was amazing. Again, the Spider-Man game was a nice reinforcement of that. God, what other games? So I have some classics, like I love Chrono Trigger. I thought that was my first wake-up call that, narratives should be more. Grim Fandango, which we already discussed. I love System Shock 2. What else? The first experience with a full-on Telltale game with Walking Dead Season 1, I thought was pretty impressive. What else? Damn it. I'm trying to think of what else I've been... Witcher 3. Well, Witcher 3 is weird because I think if the bare bones story isn't something that would grab you, but I think it's just the gameplay mechanics and all the other stories and people that you meet in the game and how deep they are, and like that's the only game where I get excited when I get a side quest. I'm like, oh man, I wonder where this is going to go, because it's not, I can't take it at face value because that's not where it's going to go. And I thought Witcher was really good about doing that. Yeah, so I don't know if that's 8, but that's a bunch I just threw out there.
that's plenty. Thank you so much. We're done. It was so great talking to you. And we have to be impartial. I was just about to say we are rooting for Planescape Torment. No, we are impartial. We're gonna see how this one plays out. Well, thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, hey, it was my pleasure. Thank you guys for reaching out. And whether Planescape wins or loses, and if it loses, it's in good company. So I think either way, it's a win for players in general. So I'm not sweating it.
Great. Have a great afternoon.
All right, you guys as well.
Yeah, we're going to bed now.
All right. Thanks for staying up so late, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Take care.
Bye.